9:14 on a Tuesday morning. A courier van pulled into the gravel lot at Marsh Iron Works and left the engine running while the driver carried a pallet jack to the loading dock. The pallet held 4 steel shipping crates, each one stenciled with a red disposal tag and a barcode from Halcourt Industrial. The driver handed a clipboard to the man standing in the bay door and said only what the manifest said to say. Director Vance said the owner could keep the scrap. The man in the bay door was Cormac Finlay, 41 years old, 11 years running a fabrication shop out of a converted mill building on the edge of Lethbridge, Alberta, with 2 full-time welders and a daughter who did her homework on the workbench every afternoon after school because the shop was where he was, and where he was, she wanted to be. He signed the clipboard without speaking. The driver left, the crates stayed. Cormac knelt beside the first one and pulled the latch. Inside, wrapped in oil-stained burlap, was a structural forming die, heavy precision machined, the kind that took months to calibrate. He unwrapped the corner and read the stamp. He read it again. His hand was steady, his breath was not. 12 years ago he had machined this die himself. 3 weeks from now, she would be driving to Lethbridge to ask for them back. Stay to the end. He left the crates on the dock and went inside to make coffee. He stood at the small window over the sink that looked out onto the lot and watched the courier van disappear onto the highway. The sky was the flat gray of an Alberta November that has decided not to commit to anything. He poured the coffee and did not drink it. His daughter Piper came in from the back at 9:30. She was 8. She dropped her backpack on the stool by the parts catalog shelf, which was where it always landed, and looked at the crates through the window. "Dad, what's in those?" "Old work." She considered this. She had learned early that old work and new work were different things in this shop, the way old snow and new snow were different things in the field behind their house. "Good old work or bad old work?" He looked at her. "The best I ever did." She nodded and pulled her library book out of her backpack and said nothing more about it. That was Piper. She knew when a thing needed sitting with. That afternoon, Cormac opened all 4 crates on the shop floor and laid out each die on wooden blocks so the bases cleared the concrete. His 2 welders, Ray and Patrick, watched from the doorway to the grinding room. "Those are Halcourt dies," Ray said. "They were," Cormac said. Patrick wiped his hands on his work apron. He looked at the disposal tags and then at Cormac. "Who signs off on scrapping those?" Someone who didn't know what they were signing off on. He did not say more than that. He covered the dies with clean canvas, locked the bay, and spent the evening in the small office at the back of the shop with a set of hand-drawn technical drawings he kept in a fireproof lockbox under the desk. He had not opened the lockbox in 4 years. The hinges moved stiffly. He spread the drawings on the desk under the lamp and sat for a long time, reading his own notes in the margins, looking at the tolerances he had worked out by hand in 2011 before the software caught up. He heard Piper brushing her teeth in the washroom upstairs. He heard the creak of her bed. He stayed at the desk until midnight. The next morning, a white SUV with Ontario plates pulled into the gravel lot and parked at the far end, near the road. The woman who stepped out was wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather portfolio. She did not look at the building first. She looked at the lot, at the crates, at the stenciled disposal tags. Her name was Simone Vance, 38 years old, Director of Procurement at Halcourt Industrial for the past 14 months. Before that, VP of Supply Chain at a mid-size manufacturer in Oakville. Before that, the woman who had cleaned out her mother's house alone in a January that she did not talk about, and had gone back to work 10 days later because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still was something she had not learned how to do. She walked to the bay door and knocked twice on the frame, which was open. Cormac was at the workbench, running a calibration check on a measuring arm. He looked up. "Mr. Finlay." "Director Vance." She set the portfolio on the corner of the workbench. "I need a supplementary release document signed, standard disposal transfer, same terms as the original manifest. My legal team drafted it this morning." She opened the portfolio and turned it to face him. He set down the measuring arm. He read the document from the top, not skimming, every line. She watched him the way a person watches a stoplight that they're certain is about to change and that keeps not changing. "Take your time, Mr. Finlay. I understand it can be a lot of language to work through." He turned to the second page. He turned back to the first. He signed where indicated and pushed the portfolio back across the workbench. She had expected a question. She had expected negotiation, or at least the performance of it. She got neither. She slid the signed pages back into the folio. As she turned to leave, her eyes moved across the shop. The tooling racks organized by process. The welding bay with the safety curtains hang straight. A photograph tacked above the grinding station. A large span pedestrian bridge over a river canyon. The kind of installation that made structural engineers pause when they drove past. She paused there for a second and a half. Then she continued toward the door. Neat little operation. Very hands-on. She got into the white SUV and drove east. She told herself the mild unease in her chest was fatigue. She had flown into Calgary at 6 that morning and driven to Lethbridge without stopping. That was all it was. Cormac stood in the empty bay. He said one thing to the room, not loud, the way a man says something to fix it in place. "Do you know what die number 3 is for, Miss Vance?" It was not for her. She was already on the highway. It was for the part of him that had already decided what came next. From the top of the stairs, Piper called down, "Dad, who was that?" "Someone from out of province." "What did she want?" "To make sure I had signed something." A pause. "Did you?" "I did." Another pause, then, "Okay, Dad," and the sound of her feet padding back to her room. That evening he called the only number in his phone he had not called in 2 years. "Ted, it's Cormac. I need you here. There's something on the shop floor you have to see in person." Ted Brower arrived the following morning in a pickup that had spent its best years hauling equipment across 3 provinces. He was 56. He had worked with Cormac at Halcourt from 2009 to 2015, back when the company was still building its industrial tooling reputation and still worth working for. He walked into the bay and stopped 6 steps inside. He looked at the 4 dies on their wooden blocks. He did not speak for close to a minute. He crossed to die number 3. He crouched. He read the die stamp and the calibration mark, and he looked up at Cormac with an expression that was past surprise and into something older. They were actually going to scrap them. Cormac handed him the disposal manifest. Ted read it twice. 3 years of your life, Cor, right here on this floor. He stood and brushed concrete dust from his knees. You need to know something. When you were at Halcourt, before Simone Vance came in, the previous director, Carruthers, understood exactly what this tooling was. He commissioned an independent appraisal in 2021. The dies were valued at just under $2 million. Carruthers flagged them as non-disposable heritage assets and put that flag in the system. Someone removed the flag before the disposal order was generated. That someone was Aldrich Moore. Cormac did not move. Moore has been working the procurement side for 9 years. He's been routing asset disposals through a contractor in Red Deer that fronts for a private resale network. Machinery, tooling, anything that can be moved before the paperwork catches up. Vance inherited the position and inherited the system. She doesn't know the system is broken. She doesn't know who you are. Moore has been feeding her bad data since her first month in the job. Ted turned to look at him directly. I'm not going to tell her any of this. Ted studied him for a long count. You're going to restore 4 heritage dies and let her think she disposed of them to a shop she insulted. I'm going to restore 4 heritage dies because they deserve to be restored. What happens after that is hers to figure out. Ted let out a slow breath. All right, what do you need? Your eyes on the calibration for number 2 in 6 weeks. You've got both. That same evening, in a glass-fronted office in the Halcourt building in downtown Calgary, Simone sat at her standing desk reviewing a logistics audit. She worked for a while and then stopped and looked at the window, not through it, at her own reflection in it. She had been at Halcourt for 14 months. In that time, she had restructured 3 supply chains, terminated 2 underperforming vendor contracts, and signed off on a volume of disposal orders that she had not had time to review individually because the system flagged them, and Aldrich Moore told her. The flags were routine and she had believed him because he had been there 9 years and she had been there 14 months, and grief does not leave your hands steady enough to question everything. She turned off her desk lamp. She put on her coat. In the parking garage, she sat in her car for a moment before starting it. The mechanic, the fabricator, she corrected herself, had signed the document without a word and then said something she could not account for as she walked out. She couldn't remember what it was. She had been most of the way to her car, but something in the way it sounded had followed her down the highway. She started the car and drove home. By the following Thursday, Cormac and Ted were into 14-hour days. Die number 2 was on the precision grinding table. Die number 4 had been fully disassembled, the compound curves mapped by hand against the original specification drawings because the digital files from 2011 had been archived to a server that Halcourt's IT department had decommissioned in 2020. Cormac's hands knew the angles anyway. He had ground these profiles the first time. Muscle memory is a long kind of knowing. That morning, Halcourt's legal coordinator called. Director Vance would prefer to handle a final waiver in person at a mutually convenient location, the Black Rock Coffee House in Lethbridge, Thursday at 11. Cormac washed his hands twice. He did not change his flannel shirt. There was machine oil along the right cuff that had gone into the fabric and was going to stay there, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The Black Rock was half full at 11. Construction crews at the long table by the window. A pair of agricultural consultants at the counter. A woman with a toddler in a high chair near the door. Simone had taken the center table. She had her procurement manager on one side and a legal associate on the other. A flat white steamed in front of each of them. Across the table, a chair and a glass of water already poured. Cormac came in at 11 past 11. The bell above the door was a cowbell, the kind that swings instead of rings. He had a folded copy of the Lethbridge Herald under one arm and the original disposal manifest in his other hand. He stopped inside the door to stamp the snow off his boots. Simone looked up. Her eyes moved from his work boots to the oil on his cuff to the reddening of his hands from the cold outside, and she said, at a volume the adjacent tables could not avoid hearing, "Mr. Finley, I appreciate the effort of coming into town. I would have thought, though, that a professional appointment might warrant a clean shirt, but perhaps the standards are different this far out." The legal associate covered a laugh with a cough. The construction crew at the window table went quiet. A man in his 50s, sitting alone with a coffee and a notebook, turned slightly in his chair and did not turn back. Cormac did not break stride. He walked to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down. He set the Herald on the table beside him. He reached across and took the document from the legal associate without waiting to be offered it. "May I read it?" It was not a question. By all means, we're in no particular rush. Simone lifted her flat white. He read Clause 1. He read Clause 2. He turned the page and read Clause 3. He read Clause 3-4 twice. He turned to the signature page, accepted the pen when the associate slid it across the table, and signed in 2 places. He pushed the document back. He stood. He picked up the Herald. He looked at Simone once, at the level, and said, without raising his voice, "Do you know what die number 3 was designed to make, Ms. Vance?" Simone's flat white stopped moving. She had not used the phrase die number 3. She had not numbered the dies at all. The disposal manifest listed them by barcode. Moore had handled the physical inventory. Moore had assigned the shipping order. Moore had chosen what went on which pallet. How did this man know there was a number 3? Cormac walked back past the construction crew, past the man with the notebook, through the bell at the door. Simone sat still. The legal associate said something. She did not hear it. She put her flat white down without having taken a sip and gathered the documents herself, which was not what she did, and walked out ahead of her own people. She drove back to Calgary with the radio off. She told herself the feeling was nothing. A fabricator in a mill building who had read a contract carefully, nothing. But the line about die number 3 sat in her chest the way a splinter sits before you've found it. No visible wound, just a specific and locatable discomfort. By the start of the second week, she had pulled every disposal contract processed in the past 3 years through the procurement system. She asked for the originating request on each one. She asked for the heritage asset flags. She asked to see the appraisal records. Aldrich Moore brought her the files personally, which he had never done before, for a routine audit request. She noticed that. She stayed late that night with the records and a yellow legal pad. By 1 in the morning, she had found 3 disposal contracts with identical irregular clauses, a receiver discretion provision that waived all right of recovery, retroactively clearing Halcourt of any liability for what happened to the assets post-transfer. Each one had been initiated by Moore. Each one had been pushed through under delegated signing authority that she had granted him in her second week on the job, when she had been too new and too tired, and still too close to January, to read everything that crossed her desk. She put the legal pad face down on her desk and sat for a while with her hands in her lap. She pulled out her phone and called her sister. Her sister did not answer. It was 1:15 in the morning. She drove home and did not sleep much. On Wednesday, she drove back to Lethbridge without telling her office. She arrived at Marsh Ironworks at 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing she saw when she stepped into the bay was Ted Brower standing at the parts bench sorting gauge pins into a tray labeled Keep and a tray labeled Worn. She stopped. She had met Ted Brower twice, both times at industry events when he was still at Halcourt. He had been at the memorial service for the company's original founder the previous spring, standing near the back of the room, and she had meant to speak to him, and had not. "Mr. Brower." Ted looked up. He glanced once at Cormac, who was at the grinding table with a depth micrometer. Then he looked back at Simone. "Mrs. Vance, what brings you out here?" "Looking at a few things." She turned to Cormac. He had set the micrometer down and was watching her. Die number 3 sat on the cradle beside him. It had been surface ground and hand-lapped and oiled. It no longer looked like something that had been wrapped in burlap and shipped on a pallet. It looked like something that had been cared for. "Who are you, Mr. Finley?" "A fabricator." "Fabricators don't get Ted Brower driving down from Tabor to sort gauge pins on a Saturday." Cormac looked at her for a long count. He did not answer. She held his gaze longer than she held most people's. She had been told often enough that it had started to feel like a weather report, that she was direct to the point of unsettling. She did not find him unsettled. She left without asking again. That night she sat in her hotel room in Lethbridge with the original procurement file for the Halcourt tooling program from 2009 to 2015, which she had pulled from the physical archive before leaving Calgary. The program had been built around a single lead designer. The program notes said only, "Primary tooling engineer, external contract, see vendor file." The vendor file had been cross-referenced to a document that no longer existed in the system. Someone had deleted it. She looked at that line for a long time. The third week, Simone came back to the shop 3 times. She did not explain why she came. The first time she sat in the wooden chair in the small office and drank coffee from the pot. Cormac kept on the burner and asked no questions. The second time she brought a paperback and read in the office while Cormac and Ted worked the bay. The third time she walked out into the bay itself and stood 12 feet from the grinding table and watched Cormac work the surface of die number 1. She watched his hands. At 4:15, Piper came in from school. She dropped her backpack on the stool, walked into the bay, and saw the woman in the dark coat standing near the bench. "You came back." "I came back." Piper studied her the way 8-year-olds study things that don't yet have a category. "Do you want to see what Dad is making? I can explain it. I know all the parts." Simone opened her mouth. She said yes. They sat in the small office, Piper's library book about manufacturing processes open between them on the low table. Piper explained the forming cycle the way she explained everything, thoroughly, without hurrying, with occasional pauses to make sure the other person was following. "So the die is like a very specific shape that the metal has to become. Dad says the shape has to be perfect or nothing works. He says that's true for most things." Simone laughed. It was short and it surprised her and it was real. At the grinding table, Cormac slowed his hands. He did not stop working. The next morning, Simone drove to Tabor and parked outside Ted Brower's house. Ted answered the door in a worn Halcourt Company jacket with grease on the cuffs. "Mr. Brower, who was the original tooling engineer for the Halcourt Precision Forming Program?" Ted looked at her for a long count. He had a non-disclosure that had been drafted for a situation that no longer existed but had never formally lapsed. "You've already met him." "Where?" "You know where, Miss Vance." She drove back toward Lethbridge. She did not go to the shop. She parked on the street 200 meters down and watched the light from the bay windows fall yellow across the gravel lot. She could see Cormac moving inside, working by the overhead lamp. She could see, after a moment, Piper's smaller silhouette at the workbench, sitting beside him, looking at something in her hands. She did not go in. She drove back to Calgary that evening, with the heater running and the radio off and the highway straight and dark in front of her. Friday morning, Aldrich Moore came to her office with a slender folder and a tone she recognized as the one he used when he believed he held the advantage. "I think we need to address the Finley situation." He set the folder on her desk. On top was a provision she had not seen before, a reversion clause in the original Halcourt tooling contract from 2012. If any former Halcourt contractor used proprietary tooling geometry to produce components for a commercial client within 10 years of the contract's expiry, Halcourt retained the right to reclaim the tooling and pursue damages. Finley restores those dies, and the minute he runs a production job we can move. We recover all four. We claim damages. He loses the shop. He smiled. It was a practiced smile. "Leave it with me," Simone said. When he was gone, she sat for a long time at her desk. She turned the folder over without opening it again. She knew two things. 1. Moore had built this file. Moore knew exactly who Cormac Finley was. Moore had still signed the disposal order, which meant Moore had wanted those dies to go to him. 2. She did not know why. She put the folder in the bottom drawer and turned the key. On Monday of the 4th week, she drove back to Lethbridge. She had a document folder on the passenger seat. She had spent the weekend with it, and with the procurement records, and with a corporate lawyer she trusted who billed by the hour and did not ask questions she hadn't asked first. She set the folder on the workbench in front of Cormac. "My predecessor at Halcourt, Director Carruthers, commissioned an asset appraisal in 2021. I found the appraisal report in the physical archive. You're named in it, not by position, by name." She opened the folder. Cormac wiped his hands on a clean rag. He read the first page of the appraisal report. He read the second. "He valued the dies at $1.8 million, Simone said. He flagged them as non-disposable heritage assets and wrote in the report that the tooling geometry could not be replicated without the original engineer's involvement. That flag was removed from the system in March of this year. The access log for the removal is on page 3. Cormac turned to page 3. "Aldrich Moore, March 9th. "There's more," Simone said. Her voice was even. She had learned to make her voice even in situations where it did not want to be. "I pulled the external asset sales records for the Red Deer contractor that Moore has been routing disposals through for the past 6 years. 3 Halcourt tooling sets that were listed as scrapped and decommissioned were sold privately, 2 to buyers in the United States, 1 to a buyer in Germany. The transaction records are on pages 4 through 9. Cormac did not move for a moment. He looked at the pages. "Total amount misappropriated," he said. "Best estimate from what I could verify, $3.4 million over 6 years. There are likely contracts I haven't found yet." The shop was quiet. Ted was in the grinding room. Through the window in the door they could see him bent over the precision table, not looking up. Simone closed the folder carefully. "When the disposal order was generated for these 4 dies, I signed it because the system flagged it as routine and Moore told me it was routine. I did not look at the asset history. I did not read the flag that had been removed. I did not know your name." She paused. "I called your shop a hands-on little operation, in a coffee shop, in front of people." "You didn't know." "That's not an excuse. It's a reason. There's a difference." She looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me who you were, at the beginning? Why didn't you just say?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you didn't have any reason to believe me. A man in a flannel shirt in a shop in Lethbridge telling you he's the person who designed your company's most valuable tooling, with no way to verify it and a document in your hand saying otherwise. You would have looked at me and seen someone making a claim. I needed to save those dies whether you believed me or not. The rest had to come from the evidence." She looked at him for a long time. Piper came in from the office with 2 mugs. She handed one to Simone without ceremony, the way she handed things to people she had decided were staying. "Dad says when things are complicated, hot drinks help." Simone took the mug. She held it in both hands and did not say anything for a moment. Then she looked at Piper. "Does it work?" Piper considered this seriously, usually. That night, from the parking lot of the hotel on Mayor Magrath Drive, Simone called her corporate lawyer. "Tomorrow morning, 7. Bring the employment records, the procurement audit, and the vendor contracts going back to 2018. Don't tell anyone at Halcourt you're coming." She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark of the hotel room with the curtains not quite meeting and a slice of parking lot light across the ceiling, and thought about the appraisal report and the deleted flag and the man in the shop who had said there was a difference between an excuse and a reason. She thought he was right about that. By the end of the 5th week, die number 1 was mounted for a test run on the press. It was a Wednesday afternoon. The press room was a concrete annex behind the main shop, separated from the bay by a steel roll-up door that Cormac had installed himself in 2019. He had paid for the sound dampening in 4 installments. He set the die in the press, checked the alignment 3 times, checked the hydraulic pressure, checked the alignment again. He had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 2 weeks, and his hands were steady and his eyes were clear because some things, once started, will not let you be careless. Ted stood at the monitoring station. Piper sat on the tool chest in the corner with her ear protection on and her library book open to a page she had not turned in 20 minutes. Simone stood beside Cormac 2 feet from the press. She had taken her coat off. She had rolled her sleeves to the elbow, which she did not usually do in a work context, and she had not noticed herself doing it. "You should run it," Cormac said. "I don't know the machine." "You don't need to. My father always had the client run the first cycle on a new setup. He said the work should know whose hands started it." She looked at him. He nodded. She put her hand on the cycle initiation switch. She looked at the press. She pressed it. The hydraulics built. The press head descended. Die number 1 made contact with the test blank and the forming cycle ran, clean, even, no drift, no bounce, and the formed part sat in the cradle at the bottom of the stroke, with a profile that matched the specification drawing to within 0.02 of a millimeter. Ted pulled the part and measured it twice. "What did you do to the approach angle?" he said. "I had 10 years to think about it." Simone stood looking at the part in Ted's hands, the part that had cost $4,000 to dispose of and a month of 14-hour days to bring back. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she picked up her phone and walked to the far corner of the press room. "Mr. Carver, Simone Vance at Halcourt. I have 4 restored precision forming dies, original geometry verified to improved specification on the first test run. I understand your company has been looking for a source for this tooling profile for some time." She listened. "Yes, all 4. I can arrange a technical inspection in Lethbridge within the week. Full specification package, calibration records." She listened. Again. "I'll have my team send the preliminary drawings this evening. Thank you." She put the phone down on the workbench. "You didn't need to make that call," Cormac said. "You could have found a buyer without me knowing about it. They're your dies. The design is mine. The tooling program belongs to Halcourt, the appraisal value. The appraisal value goes to a man who spent a month restoring what someone in my building tried to throw away. The contract will reflect that." She looked at him. "Don't argue with me about this." He did not argue. Monday evening, Moore came to Simone's office in Calgary with 2 of his own people and a tone that had shifted from the practiced smile to something he believed was certainty. The test run data from Finley's shop was logged to the equipment network. He ran a production test on dies that are legally Halcourt property under the reversion clause. "We can file this week." Simone slid a folder across the desk to him. He did not recognize the folder. He opened it. The first page was a transaction record from the Red Deer contractor, August 2019, signed A. Moore. He read to the 3rd page without speaking. By the 5th page, his hands had changed. Simone pressed the intercom. "Please ask building security to come to my office." She did not look at Moore while she said it. She looked at the window. The following Wednesday morning, Simone walked into the Halcourt boardroom with a documentation package, and Cormac beside her. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt. It was still a flannel shirt, and he had not pretended otherwise. The board had been told the meeting concerned a fiduciary review of procurement operations, and that the procurement director would not be present. There were 11 board members. 4 had been with the company since before Simone's time. 7 had been appointed in the previous 2 years. She laid out the evidence in 38 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She presented the deleted flag, the 6-year disposal scheme, the private sales, the Red Deer contractor records, The inflated invoicing that had run parallel to the asset misappropriation, the sum total of which came to $4.1 million over 6 years. She presented Ted Brower's signed statement. She presented the original tooling contract and the appraisal report with Cormac's name on it. She presented the reversion clause Moore had tried to use and the counter-opinion from her corporate lawyer that voided it on the grounds that the disposal order itself had been fraudulently generated. The room was quiet when she finished. One of the senior board members asked about the Carver contract. "Signed this morning," Simone said. The fee for the 4-die set was sufficient to recover the appraised value of the tooling, plus a fabrication fee for the restoration work. That fee goes to Marsh Iron Works. The tooling appraisal value returns to the Halcourt operating account. Who restored the tooling? Simone nodded toward Cormac. The original design engineer of the Halcourt Precision Forming Program, the person whose name appears in the 2021 appraisal report, the person Director Carruthers described as the only engineer he had met in 30 years who understood the difference between a forming die and a forming die built to last. The vote on the full investigation and the board resolution was not close. One of the senior members, a woman who had been with the company since the founding, walked around the table when the meeting let out and shook Cormac's hand and said only, "I'm sorry it took this long." He said it took as long as it needed to. In the parking garage below the Halcourt building, Cormac and Simone walked to their vehicles at the same pace. The afternoon light came through the concrete pillars at a flat winter angle and made the painted parking lines look warmer than they were. "You're not relocating to Calgary," she said. "Piper's school is in Lethbridge. The shop is in Lethbridge." "That's 2 hours. I've made longer drives." She stopped beside her car. She did not open it. She looked at him with her keys in her hand, and the afternoon light caught the edge of her jaw and the particular set of it that she carried when she was not performing anything. "I could come to Lethbridge more often." "You could." She got in the car. He watched her pull out of the garage. Then he drove the 2 hours home with the windows cracked and the radio off. The way he had not driven since before the years he did not talk about in public, the years after Piper's mother had gone, and before he had figured out how to be the only person in the house and be enough. That night, Piper looked up from her times tables at the kitchen table. "Dad, is Miss Simone going to come back?" He sat down across from her and moved her pencil case out of the way so there was room for his elbows. "Maybe, Peanut." "I think she should." Piper said this the way she said most things, as a statement of what seemed obvious to her. She laughed at my engine explanation. "Not everyone laughs." "No," he said, "not everyone does." The winter came down hard on Lethbridge in early December, the wind off the prairie driving the cold under every door. Cormac installed new weather stripping on the bay doors, and Piper helped him by holding the roll and keeping it from unwinding across the floor, which she took seriously. Simone came on Fridays. She drove down from Calgary after the week's last meeting and came back on Sunday evenings. She did not name what this was, neither did Cormac, but Piper had given Simone her own mug, blue, with a small crack in the handle that did not affect the function, and had placed it on the second hook by the coffee maker, and Piper was not someone who gave away things that mattered to her lightly. On Saturday mornings, Simone sat in the office while Cormac worked the bay, and came out when she had a question about what she was watching. The questions were good ones. He started explaining things without being asked. She took over as Director of Operations 6 weeks after the board meeting, a newly restructured role that carried more authority and more accountability than the procurement position. She hired a procurement manager who had spent 8 years at an aerospace supply chain. She spent Tuesday and Thursday mornings with him going through every vendor contract in the system line by line. On Saturday afternoons, Piper showed her how to play the card game she had invented, which had 17 rules and was balanced in a way Piper found satisfying and adults found impenetrable. Simone lost 12 times in a row and was publicly informed on the 13th game that she was improving. "Dad gets it now," Piper said. "He wasn't good at it either at first." "That's reassuring," Simone said. Cormac, watching from the kitchen doorway, turned back to the stove before either of them saw him smile. In the shop, 3 new contracts had come in, precision forming work for a manufacturer in Red Deer, which had a quality specification that Cormac found satisfying. and 2 smaller contracts that Ray and Patrick could run largely independently, which gave him time to spend on a redesign he had been thinking about for years, a forming geometry that addressed a fatigue failure mode he had first noticed in 2013 and had never had the time or resources to solve. Ted came twice a week. They worked on the redesign in the evenings after Piper was in bed, and occasionally Simone stayed late and sat at the desk in the office with her laptop, and the 3 of them were in the building, together with the overhead lamp on and the prairie wind against the metal walls, and it was a thing none of them needed to remark on. One evening Simone looked up from her laptop and asked, "Do you miss anything about the way it was before?" Cormac was at the bench. He set down the gauge he had been reading. "Before what, specifically?" "Before this. Before the dice showed up. Before I walked into your shop and said what I said." He thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which took a moment. "No," he said, "I miss some things from further back, not from before." She went back to her laptop. The wind moved against the walls. Ted, not looking up from the drawing he was reviewing, said nothing, which was exactly right. On a Saturday in March, they drove out to the Oldman River with Piper, who had decided that she wanted to learn to identify rocks by type, which had led to the purchase of a field guide and a small canvas bag for collecting specimens. She moved ahead of them along the bank, crouching periodically to examine the gravel bars with the seriousness she brought to everything she had decided mattered. Cormac and Simone walked behind her. The river was running fast with snowmelt, brown and cold, and the sky was the blue that southern Alberta produces in March, like a promise after a long argument. "My father used to say," Simone said, "that the best designs are the ones that look inevitable afterward, like the answer was always there and you just had to find the right approach." He designed things? He was a civil engineer, bridges mostly. She watched Piper hold a piece of sandstone up to the light. "He died the January before I took the Halcourt job. I went back to work too fast. I knew I was going back too fast." She paused. "I signed things I should have read." "You were lied to by someone who knew you were vulnerable." "Yes," she said it plainly. "That's also true." They walked a long way without speaking. The river moved beside them, doing what rivers do regardless. Piper turned and held up a flat gray stone. "Dad, what is this one?" He called back, "Shale peanut, look at the layers." She turned it in her hands, nodded, put it in the bag. That evening, before Simone drove back to Calgary, Cormac handed her a small wooden case. She opened it. Inside, set in a bed of dark felt, was a formed part, the test piece from the first run of die number 1, the one that had come out of the press on the afternoon she had pressed the cycle switch. He had finished the surface and engraved the base. "Halcourt PF Ironworks, first run. You should have the piece that started under your hand," he said. She did not say thank you. She held the case for a moment. She looked at it. Then she put it carefully on the passenger seat and looked at him for 1 full second before she pulled out of the lot. The Friday after that, she came back. And the Friday after that. In June, the redesigned forming geometry passed its validation testing at a manufacturer's facility outside Edmonton. The fatigue failure mode that Cormac had first noticed 11 years before was resolved. The test data showed a service life improvement of 31% over the previous design. Ted stood at the console and looked at the numbers for a long time before he said anything. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since 2013. And it took 4 dies showing up on a pallet to give you the time to finish it." Cormac looked at the validation report. "It took a few things." Ted looked at him. He looked at the report. He reached over and shook Cormac's hand once firmly, and then walked away to get coffee, which was what Ted did when he was satisfied. Simone was not there for the validation test. She was in Vancouver at an industry conference. She called that evening, and Cormac told her the numbers, and there was a pause on the line, and then she said, "Your father's saying, about the answer always being there. I think about that." "My father never said that." "I know, I said that." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the shop window, the June sky was still light at 9 in the evening, that particular extended prairie twilight that felt like a margin of something extra. "It's true, though," he said. She did not answer immediately. He could hear the city behind her, the way a city sounds from a hotel window when the window is open. "Yes," she said, "it is." Piper called from upstairs that she needed help with her spelling words, which was unlikely, but which was also a thing she said when she had been patient long enough and wanted her father present. He said good night to Simone. He went upstairs. He sat on the edge of Piper's bed under the lamp that had been his father's lamp and worked through the spelling list while Piper leaned against his arm and spelled each word correctly, and then pretended to need to be told if she was right, because being told you are right by someone who means it is not a small thing at any age. The lamp threw its circle of light. The window was open to the June evening. Below in the lot, the shop was dark, and the press room was dark, and the wooden case on the passenger seat of a car parked on a street in Vancouver held a small formed part in dark felt, with a date on the base that was the beginning of something that had been, like most good things, a long time finding its right moment. I keep thinking about the moment Cormac knelt beside that first crate and read the stamp on the die he had machined with his own hands 12 years before. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't post anything. He covered the dies with clean canvas and went back to work. That image has stayed with me longer than most things I've come across, because it says something true about the kind of person who actually builds things that last. What Aldrich Moore had was position and patience and the confidence of someone who had been getting away with something for long enough that he'd stopped watching for the moment it would end. He moved assets, erased flags, routed money through contractors in Red Deer. And he did it all from inside a system that trusted him because he'd been there 9 years and because grief had left the new director's hands too unsteady to read every document in her first weeks on the job. That's not an excuse for what she signed. Simone would be the first to say that, but it is the reason, and there's a difference Cormac named clearly, and that she had the honesty to accept. What I find myself coming back to is that the same circumstances that let Moore build his scheme for 6 years were also the circumstances that made it inevitable it would come apart. He needed Cormac not to know his own value. He needed Simone not to ask the right questions. He needed Ted Brower to stay quiet. He needed the appraisal report to stay buried and the access log to go unread. That is a lot of things that need to keep not happening, and the honest truth about people who actually know what they're doing, who have spent years learning one thing deeply, who show up when it's hard, who fix what deserves fixing whether anyone is watching or not, is that they have a way of making the things that need to keep not happening, happen. Cormac didn't restore those dies to prove a point. He restored them because they were worth restoring. That's the part I find hardest to hold on to in my own life, that you can do the right work for the right reason without needing the outcome to validate the decision. He signed the disposal document, covered the machinery, called Ted, and got to work. He didn't know how it was going to resolve. He just knew what the dies were worth and what he was capable of, and he let those two facts be enough to start. Simone's part of this matters too, and I don't think it gets said clearly enough. She had every reason to close the folder when Moore brought it to her desk. She was tired. She was still close to January. The reversion clause was real, and the legal argument wasn't nothing. She chose to look at what was actually in front of her instead. That takes a different kind of courage than building something from scratch. It takes the willingness to look at your own decisions and say, out loud, I signed things I should have read, and then do something about it. I think what this story keeps pointing me back to is that character is not a single quality. It's 3 things working together. It's the integrity to act honestly when dishonesty would be easier and no one would immediately know. It's the understanding to see what something is actually worth, not just what someone tells you it's worth. And it's the steadiness to keep going through the weeks when the outcome is uncertain, and the bay doors are closed, and the dies are still in crates, and all you have is the work in front of you and a daughter who brings you coffee and calls it a system. Piper knew what her father was doing before she had words for it. She brought the cocoa every night until he was done. That's a kind of knowing that doesn't come from anywhere other than watching someone be exactly who they are for a long time without making a performance of it.